Managing a software application inventory for a business can be extremely overwhelming given the proliferation of applications that might be in use across the organization. So in today's video, I'm going to show you some tools, some templates, and techniques that you can leverage to build a foundational governance layer for these applications so you can scale out in additional restrictions over time and have a central inventory that you can reference over time. Before we dive in, just a quick introduction. My name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I create content around Microsoft in the SMB space. A lot of that you can find on my blog at t-365.com. Okay guys, so diving in here, we're going to double click and zoom in on our layer 1 protections today. If you followed my video last week, you know we're going to go through this little mini series on kind of a progressive path of protections that you can implement between, some foundational governance as well as technologies with your native Microsoft 365 tooling. And so last week we did talk about kind of the default settings in Microsoft where users can register apps on their own, unimpeded, and some of the basic practices and lack of governance that lead to a lot of risk exposure for the business as it relates to these software applications. And so when we zoom in on layer 1 protections today, we're going to be talking about number one, if you onboard a customer, having a conversation and asking questions around the basics of software inventory and governance, which is, do you have some type of vendor management policy today where it kind of defines a checklist or what you do for evaluating vendors that you onboard, and then more around their life cycle about periodic review to make sure that there's still a secure application that you want to be partnered with over time. And then we also want to look at a central store or central inventory for approved software applications so that we can centrally track that over time, but also understand what is authorized and unauthorized software on our network, which can really help in security investigations, but also, just really defines zero trust principles, what we want to adopt that says, hey, this has earned our trust, so we're going to let it move across the network, but we're also going to monitor it for security as well. So when we talk about the why to the customer in the sense of why we should be doing this and getting them to have buy-in for the other protections we might want to implement as part of projects in the future, really, you can kind of go about it in two different angles. We're talking to business leaders who can understand, obviously, tool proliferation and unwanted burn and spend for tools that are no longer in use or could be collapsed and consolidated. But on the security end, a lot of what's relatable there too is customer data that's exposed to potentially vulnerable applications or databases where if it was compromised, it could actually damage your reputation. It's that supply chain risk that you have there as well. But additionally, we do see a lot of attacks, where these vulnerable applications have public exploits where an attacker can leverage that for compromising a device, compromising a user, and then performing some other type of activity like ransomware or something like that. So it's really important that we get, an approved asset inventory that we're tracking over time, and express that to the client so that we can get into a good motion of putting these protections in place. First things first, though, you want to take a look, and I'm going to pivot into showcasing an example of a vendor management policy that goes over what you do in the sense of governance as it relates to onboarding and ongoing review. So this is an example of a vendor management policy, and I'll link this in the description of the video, my blog. But this is something that you guys could fork over and adopt. Really, it's pretty basic as far as a standard goes. You can reach different levels of maturity over time. And when I say that, when we talk about this, we really talk about a purpose of this, but we also talk about the policy that we have as a company for reviewing vendors that we intend to onboard into our ecosystem. And in this case, we're just saying that we're looking for a classification of a lower risk vendor versus a higher risk vendor. And over time, you might have further delineation in those risk scores or, how they step up over time. That makes you do certain activity in the sense of the reviews or the standards that you perform against them. A low risk vendor, you might just review annually, as you can see here in this policy, versus a high risk vendor. You want to make sure they have, certifications like SOC 2. They have higher standards for things like encryption and RBAC and, the protection of data. So there's different levels to that. But this is really just giving you two sides here, a bifurcation between low and high risk vendors. And you can further classify that if you had, other things you wanted to do there. But this really comes down to these three basic checks that we're doing today to get started here, which is Will the vendor have direct access to company systems or software? And that could be a tool that integrates to common tooling like Microsoft, could integrate to your finance systems, your ERP tools. That would, be a little bit more risky in that sense, depending on the permission sets that they get. Will the vendor have access to customer employee PII or PHI? Very important one here. Something like, your ERP tool has a bunch of customer data in there that you would not want to have exposed, really sensitive information in most cases around their address and things like that. And then is the vendor critical to business operations? And so that could be, the bifurcation between a tool like Canva, which is, if you're not familiar, more of a marketing tool that allows people to build, this pretty marketing content versus, your PSA tool as a MSP, where you do all of your operations today between CRM, billing, ticketing, everything like that. So it's really a critical vendor to your business. And so as you can see here, for our high-risk vendors, we hold them to a higher standard, both on, the initial vetting, but also on the periodic review process we have. And I'm not going to go through all these. You guys can read through them and kind of derive your own, but you want to have this basic checklist that can be met. That also is something that you can track as part of your software inventory library, which is where we'll pivot next. Okay, so this is the template that I'll give you guys. Just you can use as an example. You could fork it and build other columns here, but this is what I like to do in the sense of a basic standard here, where we have the vendor name, the business purpose, the department owner, and then starting to get into some of those questions, that we have across the board as far as, what we are checking for as part of that onboarding process. So this is something that in next week's video, we'll go through an automation workflow that I built that allows you to autofill this out based off of a vendor request and approval workflow. But in this particular case, we want to catalog, those critical items here as far as the sensitivity of data that's coming through. For IT, it's also helpful to understand if it's deployed to workstations, if it's, access is bound to everybody in the company, or if it's department specific, or if it's to individual users. Kind of like to layer this in more of a drop down than just having it, free form in that way. And then we have some considerations for approvers of the application. And this is again where we'll get into an automation where that can fill that out. And then, this is also saying, is this in use? Hey, we're going to catalog this. In this case, I'm just looking at one, type of security addition, which is, does it have MFA bound to it? And then we're looking for certifications. And then we're periodically reviewing the security, in those low risk vendors, we might do once a year. And the high risk vendors, we might be doing that quarterly as an example, or biannually. So this is a great template. Again, I think you can use to just start to get a baseline going. Depending on the business, you might want to cater this even further. And there might be additional considerations, you would want to add depending on your workflows. We talk about doing an initial population of the software inventory. You may get, the company to manually do that if they don't already have one in place, as in just do your best shot as far as what you think all the approved applications in the environment should be, and some of those data points around if they contain customer data and other sensitive types of information where they're classified as high or critical, to the business, so that you understand, where that data exists to help protect that over time as well too. But if they don't, you can additionally, begin to do some type of a gap analysis on the software and actually pull data from Microsoft to get a baseline inventory that you could send to them as well, which is what we're going to get into here next. One of the first places you can look is in the Entra Admin Center under Applications and Enterprise Applications. This is a list of applications that the organization has consented to, and they usually have a certain levels of permission into your Microsoft environment. So it's a great place to start. This goes beyond just somebody signing up to an application with their business email, which you can also detect, and I'll show that in later videos. But this is something, that you want to look at, I think, first and foremost, to see if these applications are still in use, but also if they have excessive permissions and if they're legitimate or not. That should be approved within the ecosystem. So some of these here, you can see like Calendly is a really popular application here for integrating with Microsoft Calendar so that you can schedule really easily. But you can see things here in, the sense of the permissions that this application has access into. And this is where, again, I was saying, attackers can use either legitimate or fake types of applications like this to grant themselves permissions into the Microsoft environment to maintain persistence and to move laterally and perform all kinds of techniques. So it's good to look at there. We'll be doing a deeper dive on this in the future, but you can also see usage and insights here in the sense of, recent success or failures of sign-ins within the past 30 days to understand if it's even still in use from just a login activity. There are some applications that we'll get into as well when we go into the sign-in logs that may not have any interactive sign-ins, but they actually use what's known as a service principal sign-in, which is basically automated behind the scenes with the levels of access that they get. Fin here is a great example where it's doing a periodic check to look for a usage sync of users within the environment. And we can see that it has a bunch of activity and it's trying to sync here, multiple times a day. But within the user sign-ins, we don't get any sign-ins found because that's not actually somebody who's logging into that portal. So we'll do a deeper dive on that, but this is a good place to start in the sense of understanding the applications in use within the organization. Some of these will be Microsoft specific, so there is a little bit of noise in here just as a call out, like these graph command line tools, Power App Platform, but those are legitimate applications from Microsoft that you should likely keep in there if they're in use as well. And then on the Defender side, if you have something like Business Premium or E5, you do get Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business if it's in Business Premium. And this allows you to do an automatic collection of software inventory on devices that are enrolled in Defender and actually is doing vulnerability scanning as well. So this will extend everything from, your OS that needs to be patched that have, public threats or exploits on them, as well as any other third-party application that you might want to look at patching as well. So it's another good location. This one's definitely going to be much more verbose in the sense of noise, but there are some in the sense of what you could relate to the customer of why you need to start managing this. Again, part of the why, where you have a lot of applications that are installed on devices that aren't being managed centrally whatsoever or have these public exploits that has a high risk to the business. The OS layer is something that may be also just going through a patch cycle, right? But there's other third parties that you want to address as well here too. In later videos, I'll show you guys how to configure this so that you can enroll devices for this and see this vulnerability inventory if you're not already set up to do so. If you guys are interested in gathering that data really quickly as part of an automated security assessment, along with a lot of the posture management and policies that we're going to look at as part of this video series, definitely check out this tool, CloudCapsule, that I built that allows you to scan a Microsoft tenant in under 90 seconds. And it actually auto maps to popular frameworks like CIS and NIST. After you sign up, you'll be able to run a free assessment, and you can actually go into the application section to see the software inventory and the enterprise apps directly for this particular customer, and then multi-tenant over time as well too, as you add other customers into the ecosystem. So if you want to check this out, go to cloudcapsule.io and run your free assessment today. Okay guys, so this last section here is specifically for MSPs. If we talk about traditional application management, this involves maybe a lot of different facets of that life cycle. And you can see them here between supporting the app, billing for it to the customer, managing the access as in, granting or removing access with employee onboard, offboard, or lateral movement, as well as patching that application and then deploying it out to workstations for those customers as well. So 99% of cases, most MSPs are doing these top two where we fully support Microsoft and then we push out our security tool set and maintain that as well, which includes everything from our RMM to top EDR tools like SentinelOne or Huntress. And we are, managing the patching cycle for those agents that exist on those devices as well. Beyond that, though, it's kind of varies by MSP in the sense of the applications you will support end to end, meaning you do everything from answering help desk questions to it, to billing it, to providing access to users for the company when they request it, or as part of employee lifecycle events, you're patching it, and you're also using RMM or Intune to deploy it to workstations. So one of the fundamental questions you should ask yourself as an MSP is, what applications do we quote unquote support today? And kind of filling in this checklist, and I perform or showcase here a little bit larger of a checklist that you could potentially use as part of that, which is, do we have support articles for it? Do we actually bill out for it? Do we perform the contract management? Do we centrally deploy it in RMM or Intune? Do we manage the patching for it? Is the tool itself configured for MFA, SSO, SAML provisioning? Do we have it managed with group membership and not just individual users? Is it whitelisted in some type of application whitelisting tool? And is it in our documentation tool? And this you could then fork off if you did put it in documentation tool on a per customer basis to make sure that you are standardized and pull reports against these common applications that you would see in your ecosystem or from the average customer environment. The big problem statement, obviously, is though every application is super unique and it could include its own boatload of support requests or problems, line of business apps, really hesitant about, obviously, to say that we're going to encompass that in our managed service agreement just because we could be at a loss with that client really quickly. So you really want to work out our approved applications that are all inclusive as part of your managed service agreement. But then additionally, what does adding this other application look like? Is that something that you could charge for time and materials every time you have to address it in support cases? Or is that something you could bake into a reoccurring model just for additional applications under management that aren't part of the approved managed service contract? It seems a little bit nickeling and diming, but I feel like if it is an application that the organization broadly uses that isn't really widespread like these other tools like Zoom and Chrome, then you might want to negotiate that in as far as the management goes. But you would want to do that not only to help streamline operations, but also to make sure you're increasing the security. One of the things that we see here a lot, in the sense of when we start to lock things down, as in remove users as local admins from workstations and also restrict app registrations, is we are, funneling them into reaching out to us at the end of the day because we're the ones who can get that application installed. In some cases, we're auto-generating tickets if we have application whitelisting tools installed on these workstations like CyberFox or a Threat Locker, but that is not always the case. So if they can't install something because they're not an admin, they're just going to open a ticket up with you or reach out to their manager who then directs them to you if they don't have that approval. But what I see very often is it's a reactive request. So they're frustrated because they have to, kind of interrupt their day to go request that. And then in most cases, they're a regular end user where we need to get additional approval from somebody at the company. And we may have this baked into our PSA where we have, the designation of an approver. But what happens in most cases is we actually go in and we just install the app after approval, but we're not doing this governance layer of reviewing it for security in some cases. It's not all inclusive. We're not documenting it into our documentation tool like IT Glue or Hoodoo. We're not whitelisting the app in any way. So the next user who has to do this or when this app needs to be updated, they're going to have to reach out again and open another ticket. And we're just adding to our overhead as well as the end user frustration. And then we're not taking a look at access controls in some cases where this might be a tool adopted by a whole department that's growing very rapidly. And we want to start to have a conversation of centralizing those access controls as well too. So the preferred path is taking a look at, building some type of submission form, which we're going to take a look at next week for a proactive request. And I'm not naive to say that the users are going to be like, hey, I'm going to go follow this process and not go to this route. But we can begin to redirect them in certain ways to the approved workflow. That'll get into an automation layer for us, but ultimately uplift our security as well too, because we're doing the proper approval checks across the stakeholders that need to be involved. But for us as MSPs, we're also getting into a governance layer where we can begin to manage the lifecycle of these applications a lot better in the sense of the documentation. Should it be an application we start to centrally deploy because it's widely used across the organization in our RMM or Intune? Should we whitelist the application because it does frequent updates like a QuickBooks, great example? Are there project opportunities that come out of this? And when I say that, you could look at, is this app eligible for single sign-on with their licensing? Can we streamline that to make it integrated from a security perspective to their Microsoft identity? Or is there SAML capabilities where we can automate the provisioning that makes their lives a lot easier and reduces the onboarding, offboarding complexity of employee lifecycle, especially at companies that have a lot of churn? And then the vulnerability scanning is the other component of it. How are we doing that? And that's more of a broad-based, you could do that across the board like we saw with Defender, but we want to make sure that we understand when this application is maybe moved into a state where there's a public exploit or vulnerabilities that we need to identify. So this is a lot, for one video, but I really wanted to cover both of those checklists in the sense of what you would do as an individual company, something you could advise on, versus what you might want to take a look at as an MSP. Okay guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you have. And if you want to keep watching this mini series on software application management, definitely subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week.